This talk is titled Left versus Left. What's happening here ain't exactly clear, and my name is Ken Eng. This talk is not intended to be focused on Unitarian Universalism. UU is currently experiencing an ideological rift, but I think that if we look at this clearly, at its core, the UU conflict did not originate in UU. It's an imported conflict. Many countries that trace their heritage back to the Age of Enlightenment are experiencing an ideological tug-of-war between traditional liberals and what I call an identity-centric movement. Most traditional liberals don't understand the belief systems underlying the identity-centric movement. I'm going to try to explain those belief systems and the reasoning behind them. I honestly have no ideas for how to resolve the conflict. The goal of this talk is to help us understand the conflict better. For instance, if you've wondered why the left focuses so much on identity groups, this talk may help you understand that. If you wondered why alternative points of view are sometimes suppressed, well, there's a reason for that. If you've wondered why it seems like anti-racism training is intentionally designed to be uncomfortable, this talk includes my theory about that. And if you've wondered how in the world reason and logic and evidence and even science are sometimes disparaged by the left, I'm going to try to explain that. I'll be synthesizing the insights and perspectives of numerous books and other published writings. The hardest thing about this talk was deciding what not to talk about. It's an extremely complex topic. It's also potentially a very contentious topic, and I need to be as fair as I can about where each side is coming from. But here's the deal. If all I do is repeat what was in the books and the essays that I've read, and if I tried to provide copious documentation for every statement I make, this talk would take hours and hours, and at the end, I still don't think you'd understand what's going on. So I'm going to try to explain things in fairly simple, everyday language where I can. And that means that it is possible that how I explain things is not exactly right. All I can say is that I'm trying very hard to get this right. Right off the bat, I need to clarify three things. First of all, this phrase, identity-centric movement, is a phrase I came up with for this talk. I wanted to talk about this movement without triggering preconceived notions. I think everyone knows what I'm talking about in general, and I actually think the words identity-centric are a good description. A major purpose of this movement is to fight against oppression of certain identity groups. But the second thing I need to clarify is that when I lead us through this topic, I'm going to focus almost exclusively on race. Race is arguably the category of identity that the identity-centric movement is based on and focuses the most on, so race is the lens that I will be using for the most part. My third clarification is that although the focus of most of this talk is not on UU, at the end, I will spend time looking for parallels in Unitarian Universalism. Once I explain the beliefs of the identity-centric movement, I do think it would be useful to consider whether this, in fact, appears to explain some of the recent trends in UU. Okay, let's start exploring the beliefs of the identity-centric movement. I'm going to start by stating that there are two fundamental assumptions. These two assumptions guide everything else I'm going to talk about. Assumption number one is that racial injustice is still a huge problem in the US. This is the assumption that the identity-centric movement is operating under. The second fundamental assumption is that racial disparities cannot be resolved by using the same old anti-racism playbook that we've been following. The assumption is that just doing more of the same, maybe doing it better or a little bit more diligently, cannot solve the huge problem of racial injustice, not in America and not in UU. For supporters of the identity-centric movement, these two assumptions are simply not debatable. They're considered to be self-evident truths. Many traditional liberals probably think these assumptions are too simplistic or exaggerations. They would push back on the idea that there is no debate needed about these assumptions. But here's the deal. Nothing else I'm going to say in this talk will make any sense unless you accept these assumptions that the identity-centric movement is based on, at least temporarily. For most of this talk, I suggest setting aside any urge to question the assumptions. You won't be able to absorb what I say if your mind keeps saying, but, but, but. I need to add a couple more fundamental beliefs of the identity-centric movement. First, the goal of anti-racism efforts needs to be equal outcomes. And second, the type of racism the anti-racism efforts need to be focused on is systemic racism. Now, again, traditional liberals might not be comfortable with these beliefs. They would ask, shouldn't the goal be equal opportunities instead of equal outcomes? But no. Identity-centric activists believe that equal opportunities is not good enough. They consider that to be outdated thinking. We need to aim for equal outcomes. Or a traditional liberal might suggest that fighting personal prejudice is what's important. Wouldn't that be the best approach? You know, racism as it's traditionally been defined. But again, identity-centric activists think that we need to look beyond that. We need to focus on systemic racism. Assuming that racism is mainly a problem of personal prejudice is considered to be outdated thinking. But even if a traditional liberal can mentally set aside their reaction of yes, but, we still might find it hard to understand the beliefs of the identity-centric movement because we're probably misinterpreting these assumptions. So before we move forward, I want to clarify some nuances about these assumptions and definitions. First of all, this isn't usually about explicit racism. What's considered to still be a huge problem is covert racism, racism that might not be evident to many people. Next, let's clarify what the same old playbook prescribed. What's being rejected is what I'm going to call merit-based policies, procedures, and rules. The ideal that we've been pursuing for the past 6 decades has been a kind of a colorblindness, a goal of making objective decisions so that race is of no consequence when institutions are making decisions. Now, this is not an absolute disregard for race. Sometimes race needs to be factored into policies to try to level the playing field. But the identity-centric movement insists that a so-called level playing field is not good enough. In other words, a goal of equal opportunities does not go far enough. That's the goal from the old playbook. The new measure of racism is unequal outcomes, not just unequal opportunities. Finally, I think most people have the wrong idea about what systemic racism is. I think even most supporters of identity-centric anti-racism don't really understand what the leaders of this movement mean when they use the terms systemic racism or structural racism. This is a key point. There's many different ways the supporters of the movement are engaged. And I think many of the people that support the movement only have a vague understanding of what the ideology driving it is all about. I think many allies and supporters simply want to end racism and other oppressions, and they take it on faith that the leaders have a good grasp on what the problem is and what solutions to pursue. In other words, we might end up in a conversation with a supporter of the identity-centric movement and say to them, what's happening here ain't exactly clear. Can you explain it to me? And what they tell us might not truly be what's happening here. Perhaps because their vision of anti-racism is not focused on the same things that the most ardent activists are focusing on. So I left off with this slide. Defining systemic racism is the key to the whole puzzle. So I'm going to drill really deep into this question. Actually, I'm going to be trying to answer 2 questions. What is systemic racism, and how do we solve systemic racism? I think there are 3 pillars that the beliefs of the identity-centric movement are based on. The first belief is that it's all about power. Everything should be looked at through the lens of power. What identity groups have power and control, and what are they using that power for? The second belief is that objectivity is not really possible. This is a belief that all knowledge is socially constructed. All knowledge is subjective. The third belief is that those affected know best. The buzzword you've probably been hearing more and more about is lived experience. What we know because of our personal experience is what should be considered to be true. Now, each of these pillars have a whole body of academic theory behind them. They come from certain philosophies, and together they form an ideology. There's something called critical theory that most clearly articulates a belief that it's all about power. There's something called postmodernism that provides the justification for the belief that objectivity is not really possible. And the belief that those affected know best comes from something called standpoint theory. These academic terms, critical theory, postmodernism, and standpoint theory, are not very intuitive. And that's why I think I can help by translating them into concepts we can all understand. So, critical theory says that everything is all about power between identity groups. This does not have anything to do with power in the traditional sense. It's not about formal power in the sense of who is formally in positions of power. No, critical theory is about informal power. It's about the power of norms. It's about the power of cultural norms. Critical theory has us categorizing everybody based on identity group membership. What critical theory focuses on is how the norms of the dominant culture in a country wield power. Critical theory postulates that it is the norms of the dominant culture that maintain the power of the dominant identity groups. The power of norms is how the dominant group preserves their power. That's the theory. But critical theory doesn't stop there. The theory concludes that the dominant culture norms privilege the dominant identity groups. More importantly, critical theory says that the dominant cultural norms actually oppress non-dominant identity groups. That leads us to a rather controversial conclusion. The conclusion of critical theory is that if you belong to a dominant identity group and you value the dominant cultural norms, then you are actually complicit in oppression. You are an oppressor. Conversely, if you belong to a non-dominant identity group, then you are oppressed. Individual exceptions to the rule do not invalidate the rule. This is the paradigm critical theory operates under. People either belong to oppressor identity groups or oppressed identity groups. It's very either or, oppressors versus oppressed. Many traditional liberals will think that this is far too simplistic, but like I said earlier, our goal today is to understand the theory, not make counter-arguments, at least not until I get through explaining these belief systems. Now let's get even more specific. In the US, white people are the dominant racial identity group. So what critical theory really concludes is that the cultural norms that the white identity group values preserves the dominance, the supremacy, if you will, of those cultural norms. And this preserves the dominance, the supremacy of the white identity group. This is what white supremacy culture really means. UUs have heard repeated calls to dismantle white supremacy culture in UU starting in the year 2017, but many people are pretty unclear about what that really means. Over the past 5 years or so, the use of the term white supremacy has become kind of a catch-all phrase in the US and in UU. The term white supremacy seems to often be used just as a stand-in for, well, the status quo or the system. I think in the 1960s, this probably would have been called the establishment. White supremacy often means basically authorities doing things that activists think are bad or unjust. It seems to me that most of the time, calling out white supremacy is just a call to make a different decision or take a different action or adopt a different policy. It's about something specific. It's about reform, not revolution. But other times it is asking for something bigger. I think sometimes when we hear a phrase like dismantle white supremacy, we need to take it literally. Sometimes this is not a call to fix a specific problem. This is a call to radically replace the system. I think this is especially true when the word dismantle is being used. I think it means exactly what it says. Dismantle the existing system so it can be replaced with something very different. When I left off, I was explaining that white supremacy culture is really about culture, not so much about race. And I've been saying over and over, cultural norms, cultural norms. Well, what am I really talking about? What are these cultural norms that the dominant white identity group values so much? When I say cultural norms, what I mean is ways of doing things that are valued. I also mean ways of conducting oneself, ways of being that are valued. And most important for this discussion, cultural norms affect ways of knowing. How do we know something? How do we know whether to believe what someone else says is true? Well, societies have norms about knowing. Certain ways of knowing are valued, other ways of knowing are less valued. Let's go back to this slide. The most important question is, what is systemic racism? And maybe now you know what my answer is. Culture, or more specifically, the dominant culture's norms. And those norms are valued ways of doing things, valued ways of being, and valued ways of knowing. But I also said that I would try to answer the question, how do we solve systemic racism? If culture is the problem, well, what is the solution? Well, we have some more background theories we need to explore first. Remember this slide? The second pillar of the identity-centric movement belief systems is that objectivity is not really possible. This is based on something called postmodernism. Part of what postmodernism claims is that all knowledge is socially constructed. What this means is that we as a society have norms about what counts as knowledge and what doesn't count. Postmodernism says this is arbitrary. Different social groups might very well use different criteria for judging what's true and real. Thus, it is claimed all knowledge is subjective. Postmodernism says that being completely objective about anything is just not possible. Remember that critical theory is very focused on the ways of knowing that the dominant identity group values. So what are the sources of knowledge that the dominant white identity group values? Well, we value logic as a way of knowing, as a source of knowledge. We value reason as a way of judging what's true and real. We value evidence to use our reason on. I would add that we value the free marketplace of ideas, a free exchange of points of view, and we value expertise. I'm thinking of scientists in particular, but also scholars with degrees or other credentials that attest to their credibility. We think these ways of knowing are self-evidently valuable because we actually believe that they lead toward the goal of objectivity. In Western culture, trying to achieve objectivity is highly valued. That's the Achilles heel, objectivity. As we saw a few minutes ago, according to postmodernists, objectivity is not really possible. Postmodernism implies that valuing these ways of knowledge is just arbitrary. All of us do acknowledge that there are, in fact, many ways of knowing. The way of knowing we value the most is something most people call rationality, but I want to call analytical. A different way of knowing that's mentioned a lot lately is lived experience. If we experience something ourselves, how in the heck can that not count as real knowledge? So what if we can't provide evidence? That doesn't mean it's not true. In fact, what could be truer or more real than something we experienced? How about intuition or feelings? We know something in our gut, even if we can't provide evidence or can't even explain it in words very well. We just know it's true. Or how about valuing what tradition has passed down to us, or valuing the wisdom that age bestows upon us? And many people believe that some things just require faith. They don't need something to be proven to be true and valued. And knowledge received by revelation can be accepted on faith as being true. I think most traditional liberals will assume that this is the whole point. The lesson is that we should start valuing other sources of knowledge more, value lived experience more, value intuition and feelings more, value all of these other ways more. Okay, lesson learned. As good liberals, we will try harder to be more inclusive in this way. No, that is not the whole point. Remember, postmodernism says the white valued ways of knowing are just arbitrary and objectivity is not really possible. And remember what critical theory said? Critical theory says that these ways of knowing are oppressive. So one source of knowledge is implicated by critical theory as being oppressive. That sounds bad. So how do we solve oppression? By no longer assigning a high value to these ways of knowing. In other words, demote them. And we're not talking about an even playing field for the constitution of knowledge. We're talking about raising other ways of knowing above the analytical ways of knowing. Think of these as the tools of the dominant culture. If you want to solve oppression, just take the oppressor's most valued tools away from them. Think about it. If logic and reason and evidence and a free marketplace of ideas and expertise count for almost nothing, wouldn't you feel kind of powerless? Okay, wow. See how that could be controversial? We just followed this line of thinking, and somehow what we ended up with is a call to reject the Western liberal Enlightenment values. These are the values that Western societies have been based on for the past 300 years. In fact, postmodernism urges the rejection of almost all of the Enlightenment values. The whole thesis of postmodernism is that modernity has led us down the wrong path. Believe it or not, postmodernists are even skeptical about science as a method for obtaining objective knowledge. In some corners of the identity-centric movement, science is not even intended to be objective. Science with a point of view, science that consciously promotes a desired end, particularly in the social sciences, is now accepted by some professional journals. If you want to know more about this, look up Grievance Studies Affair in Wikipedia. So, wow, where does this leave us? If objectivity is a mirage and all sources of knowledge are subjective, and even some science is ideologically targeted, doesn't that lead to intellectual chaos? How can we ever decide anything if there's no preferred source of knowledge? The answer, according to the identity-centric movement, is the third pillar of their beliefs. Those affected know best, or as the academics call it, standpoint theory. What matters is who is claiming knowledge about what. Where do you stand in the social hierarchies? Are you in the best position to make a claim to knowing something? This basically comes down to identity groups. If you are not a member of the affected identity group, you are not in the social position to claim to know the truth about things that haven't directly affected you. And there's a more refined version of standpoint theory. It's called intersectionality, and it's actually common sense. Everybody belongs to multiple identity groups. You belong to a racial identity group and an ethnic identity group, and you also belong to identity groups related to gender, nationality, disability, sexual orientation, and there are others. Intersectionality recognizes the combination, the intersection of those various identity groups you belong to. So, the way the identity-centric movement believes competing claims to knowledge should be prioritized is basically by adding up the relative lack of privilege based on identity group membership. In this demonstration on my slide, it is the Black female on the right who identifies as queer, whose claim to knowledge about experiences of oppression is considered to be the most relevant and authentic. She has the lived experience of 3 intersecting oppressed identities, whereas everyone else experiences at most 2 kinds of oppression due to identity. Of course, it's presumed that the white, male, hetero does not experience any oppression due to identity. This is why some points of view are dismissed out of hand, not by refuting specific statements, but by declaring that the other person is ineligible to make those statements solely due to their social position. A statement is invalidated simply by comparing positions in the intersectionality matrix. It's assumed that there's nothing the white male can do to adequately assess the perspective of the female person of color. It would take logic and reason and evidence and an adequate language to assess the lived experience of the person of color. But as we just established, those are demoted, devalued ways of knowing because they're tools of white supremacy culture. Without those tools, all that's left is to accept that the lived experience accurately represents what's true and real. And that is really the whole point. Unaffected persons should not be able to override the understandings of the affected persons by using the tools of logic and reason or asking for evidence. Now I'm going to get to the place where I think a lot of you expected me to be headed. If we say that it's all about power between racial identity groups, if we claim that it's not possible to be objective about other racial groups, if we say that those affected the most by racial injustice and disparities based on race know best, if we put it all together, we get some of the key components of critical race theory. Critical race theory already mixes the soup for us. Critical theory plus postmodernism plus standpoint theory and intersectionality, critical race theory combines them, then puts the greatest focus on racial identity. I think CRT positions race as the tiebreaker when comparing levels of marginalization and oppression. Race trumps sex and gender in the intersectionality matrix. What if two people with identical positions in the intersectionality matrix offer two very different points of view? Well, whoever is more in alignment with the beliefs of the identity-centric movement will be considered to be more authentic and relevant. If we're talking about two people of color, there's a term for not agreeing with the identity-centric ideology. It's called internalized racism. It's worth looking closely at a definition of internalized racism. By explaining what not to do, we get a glimpse into what the movement sees as the causes of racism. We can get this straight out of the Widening of the Circle of Concern report, which is considered to be the blueprint for the transformation of UU. The report defines internalized racism as someone from an oppressed racial group supporting the supremacy and dominance of the dominating group by maintaining or participating in a set of attitudes, behaviors, social structures, and ideologies that undergird the dominating group's power. I think this is exactly what I've been talking about. This definition of what not to do is perhaps the clearest definition of white supremacy culture we can find, although it is defining it by looking at it from the other end of the telescope. If you're familiar with some of the Black intellectuals who are considered to be moderates, either center-left or center-right, what I think they have in common is that they try to use logic and reason and evidence to try to think objectively about race. It's that attempt to be objective about race that gets them accused of exhibiting internalized racism. Even though they are Black, their voices are disregarded. Ironically, anyone who agrees with the identity-centric ideology can participate in promoting that ideology. It's not like white hetero males can never be on stage and never be in leadership positions. If they are affirming the paradigm of oppressor versus oppressed, a privilege versus marginalization, what they say is considered to be accurate. In fact, that's the only exception to the postmodern belief that objectivity is not possible. In critical race theory, the one thing that is objectively true is racial oppression due to the power dynamics that critical theory exposes. There are three very important implications of critical race theory. The first is that racial group identity is more important than the particular circumstances of any individual. If your racial identity group is privileged, you are considered to be privileged. If your racial identity group is oppressed, you are oppressed. Put them together, and if your racial identity group is privileged, you are an oppressor. You may not feel that as an individual, you are an oppressor, but your membership in a dominant racial identity group, and especially your implicit support of the values of your racial identity group, makes you complicit with racial oppression according to critical race theory. You may experience oppression yourself due to other identities you have, but that does not offset your complicity in racial oppression. There's no gray area here. The second implication of critical race theory is that racial group dynamics are the most important factor affecting outcomes. This is called race reductionism. Everything reduces to race. The third important implication of critical race theory is that our race and or ethnicity is the most important thing about us. This is called race essentialism. According to critical race theory, the lens we should perceive things is through race. The lens we should assume everyone else perceives us is through our race. By reducing the problem down to power differentials between racial identity groups, the anti-racism activists have a clear understanding of how to advance the movement. There was an iconic statement made at a conference in 2014 that I think sums up the thinking. One of the panel members said, "The question is not, did racism take place, but rather, how did racism manifest in that situation?" In other words, activists and supporters are to assume that racism is always taking place, and their job is to examine situations for evidence of it. One word used to describe this, used in earlier flavors of critical theory, was deconstruction. But there's a better word, a word I think gets to the heart of it: problematize. The activist will take a situation or written material that seems innocuous and reinterpret it to show how the situation manifests privilege and or oppression. When it happens to you personally, it can be pretty disorienting. You're thinking, wait, that's not what I meant. This is called problematizing. Well, I kind of got deep into the weeds here. Let's get back to the fundamental questions. We said that systemic racism actually comes from culture, from valued cultural norms. So how do we solve systemic racism? We demote the valued norms of the dominant culture. We just went into detail about how to demote a culture's valued ways of knowing, standpoint theory. This demotes the analytical way of thinking we value, things like logic and reason and evidence and a free marketplace of ideas and expertise. We also talked about the more refined version of standpoint theory, intersectionality. Now I'm going to say some things that are a little more controversial, and this does not come directly out of the books in so many words. In my opinion, the main point of anti-racism training is to get everybody to this slide. I think the point is to get people to accept the idea that we need to adopt standpoint theory and intersectionality. I think the challenge of anti-racism training is how to get people in the dominant identity groups to step back and accept the demotion of their norms, drop their belief in objectivity, elevate the voices of the non-dominant identity groups above their own voices, not just equal, above. This is a daunting task. Trying to explain this to people through logic and reason and evidence, like I just tried to do, is really hard. And this only works if the anti-racism trainer gets buy-in at every step. If they hit too much resistance at any step, they probably will not get the desired result. It's hard to skip over any step and keep the whole belief system logically coherent. Like I say, this is a daunting task. Maybe it's an impossible task. I think this is why they usually take a shortcut. The shortcut is to bypass the brain. One of the most effective ways to bypass the brain is to make the person emotionally uncomfortable. This allows the trainer just to skip so many steps. Just start with a strong conviction that there's still a huge problem and that the problem is caused by the system, not by individual prejudice. Then assert that if a person is a member of the dominant racial identity group, they are complicit with this oppressive system. Emotional discomfort can do the rest of the work. Think about how often we have heard that it is good and appropriate and expected for people to experience discomfort or feel uncomfortable during anti-racism training. I suspect there are two hoped-for outcomes from this. Some people might actually change their beliefs due to that discomfort, and I can't quibble too much with that as long as the person genuinely accepts the beliefs. But it's my opinion that another goal of the discomfort is to trigger conflict avoidance as a shortcut to convince people to step back and to accept the tenets of intersectionality. Now I want to turn our point of view around. I want to try to explain to the supporters of the identity-centric movement what the traditional liberals believe. Traditional liberals know that it is possible to be committed to fighting racism, yet have sincere disagreements with some or all of these points. To push back against this approach to anti-racism does not make traditional liberals anti-racism. We merely do not think that this is the right approach. I'm not going to get into the counter arguments against these individual points. I want to talk about some fundamental disagreements with this anti-racism approach. First of all, it is divisive. Emphasizing racial identity so strongly separates us. And the binary separation into oppressor and oppressed racial identity groups is divisive. Intersectionality is inherently divisive the way it's being used. The more precisely it pinpoints who we share intersecting identities with, the more it highlights all the other intersecting identities that we're not a part of. That is divisive. Traditional liberals do not believe that an approach that emphasizes what separates us is an approach that will succeed. Second, there's a fine line between making people uncomfortable in constructive ways versus demeaning them. Lots of anti-racism training can feel demeaning if we do not agree with the identity-centric anti-racism beliefs. Third, this approach to anti-racism is fundamentally intolerant. And that is not a bug, that is a feature. It fundamentally rejects a wide diversity of opinions because it asserts that any point of view based on logic or reason or evidence is oppressive. So those points of view are not tolerated. This intolerance is also divisive and can feel demeaning. And last, rejecting the Western liberal Enlightenment values is really a rejection of liberalism itself, and that makes the ideology illiberal. Traditional liberals will argue that Western liberal Enlightenment values have all been instrumental in the progress that we have made on social justice. They're not oppressive. They are the best tools we have for fighting oppression. Throwing away the best tools of Western culture is unwarranted and really reckless. There are approaches to fighting racism and other oppressions that emphasize unity, not division, that motivate people by inspiring them, not demeaning them, that believe in tolerating, not suppressing a wide diversity of opinions, and that do not discard the liberal tools that we need. Those approaches usually focus on reforming our systems, not dismantling and replacing them. Those are the approaches to fighting racism that traditional liberals support. Now I want to briefly switch our point of view one more time. As I said near the beginning, I've been using the lens of race to guide us, but there are other categories of identity, and the same model, the same three pillars, the same three theories support other lenses with some slight tweaks. For instance, if we use the lens of gender or sexuality, I'm not so sure we would say that it's all about power. It's more about privilege, the social privileges that come with being a cisgendered heterosexual male. But it's the influence of postmodernism where this gets really interesting. According to postmodernism, everything is subjective. Everything is socially constructed. So gender and sexuality, and some now contend even sex, are subjective. And it's not either or, it's a continuum. Being on a continuum, the activists assert that applying labels is somewhat arbitrary. They say labels can be misleading and perhaps not even appropriate. And naturally, standpoint theory fits these lenses perfectly, as does intersectionality. Those affected know best. Intersectionality is where the interests of all of the marginalized identity groups converge. And this is where anti-racism training ultimately works as anti-oppression training. The activist tactic of problematizing situations or materials also works really well under these lenses. They will ask, how does sexism manifest in this situation? Or how is heteronormativity privileged here? Or how is ableism assumed in this material? Well, since I already opened up Pandora's box when I talked about disagreeing with the tactics of some anti-racism training, I want to add some more counter-arguments to a crucial piece of this. I think there are some fundamental flaws with how intersectionality is being used. I already talked about how intersectionality is inherently divisive, and this is just looking at 5 categories of identity. There are many other categories of identity, for instance, income, age, religion, education, appearance, occupation, political beliefs. I'll stop there. If all of these identities add up to unique experiences, how can we ever decide what the most authoritative experience is? How can we actually pinpoint what the authoritative Black experience is, given that there are so many different kinds of Black experience? Who's to say what the authentic female experience is? I think you can see my point. There's no authoritative voice about anything. Can it really be true that, as the song says, nobody's right if everybody's wrong? Actually, according to intersectionality, every voice is authoritative in its own way. That flips the lyrics of my theme song. Nobody's wrong if everybody's right. And that can't be right either. Let's think about this a little more. Within our own identity groups, do we actually take what people say at face value? We know that everyone has biases and blind spots and vested interests. So do I assume that whatever another white man says is automatically wise? Far from it. Do I take it on faith that whatever another white person says is automatically true? Far from it. I assess what they say with reason, and I might ask for evidence, and that's how I develop confidence in what people in my own identity groups say. And I have one more criticism of intersectionality. People can often accurately attest to what happened to them, but rarely do people understand why something happened to them. Things are almost always more complicated than we realize. This is why we need to have reason and evidence and due process in our toolbox, because what's most important is not what is happening, but why it's happening. Intersectionality can't answer the why question. You can't fix something unless you know why something is happening, and that's usually very hard to figure out. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that analytical tools like logic and reason are the only legitimate sources of knowledge. And I'm not denying that these tools have the potential to be abused, to manipulate things. What I am saying is that these tools are too valuable to reject just because they're not perfect. Now I want to finally bring Unitarian Universalism under the microscope. I want to see whether the way that I have described the identity-centric movement can be detected in the transformation that UU has been undergoing since 2017. I want to offer up this congregational study action issue that was approved overwhelmingly at UU General Assembly in 2018. It was titled Undoing Intersectional White Supremacy. Let's see how they describe the situation. It starts by flatly stating that racism is fundamental to US social systems. It says that white supremacy culture operates economically, institutionally, politically, and culturally. It says white supremacy culture shaped everything we consider norms. It says white supremacy operates intersectionally. Well, let's go back to that prior paragraph. It says decentering whiteness causes us to decenter individual dignity for our collective liberation. This seems to be completely at odds with UU's first principle. The point here is to understand where the activists are coming from, what their goals are, what they think the mission should be. And I have two conclusions. First, I think this CSAI matches pretty well with what I've been talking about. It focused on culture and norms and intersectionality, just like my talk does. My second conclusion is that it doesn't sound like they want to merely reform the system. Sounds like they want to replace the system. The most important document charting the course for a transformation of UU is the Widening the Circle of Concern report from the UUA Commission on Institutional Change. If we're looking for parallels in UU, it's fair to ask, what are the ideological underpinnings of this report? Is critical race theory an appropriate frame to view this report from? First of all, the report does refer to white supremacy culture over 30 times. It seems like it assumes that everyone understands what it means by the phrase white supremacy culture. Closest it comes to defining that term is found in the appendix, where it says white supremacy culture refers to the unspoken beliefs and cultural practices that reinforce an institution's white-centered practices. Even that is pretty vague. There was a very interesting Facebook entry posted at the same time that the report was introduced at General Assembly in 2020. One of the authors of the report, Dr. Elias Ortega, who also happens to be the president of Meadville Lombard Theological School, explained that the Widening the Circle report is indeed based on critical race theory. Let me read a couple lines from his post. He says, the report mobilizes aspects of critical race theory to engage the impact of structural racism. And I think this line here is especially interesting. It says, I imagine that many within the wing of our movement cemented in classical liberalism as their political outlook will take exception to the use of critical race theory in the report. Cemented in classical liberalism. I guess that would be most of the people interested in this talk. He continues by saying, it may also happen with those who invest in incrementalist politics as their preferred option for social change. So replacing the system, not reforming its flaws, appears to be the goal of the president of Meadville Lombard Theological School. And I believe that what Dr. Ortega thinks matters a lot. Speaking of people who matter a lot, the new UUA president, the Reverend Dr. Sophia Batancourt, also believes critical race theory is the way to go. She comes from the other major UU school for the ministry, and in a sermon a couple of years ago, she said, to be as clear as I can be, let there no longer be a Unitarian Universalism that refuses to be in dialogue with the now almost 50-year-old teachings of critical race theory. Let us not make a fetish out of human reason by only turning our search for truth and meaning towards experiences we already know. I think it's interesting that she highlights human reason as being the problem that critical race theory will address. Which takes me back to Dr. Ortega's Facebook post. He has a beef with logic and reason that's a little different. He goes to great length to explain why most critics of critical race theory are really off base. What he says is that logic and reasoning work differently in social sciences. If we use our normal understanding of logic and reason to critique critical race theory, well, that kind of logic and reasoning is just not a valid tool. He calls that rational infelicities. Dr. Ortega is taking the oppressor's tools out of the toolbox. But even if Dr. Ortega admits the Widening report is based on critical race theory, we don't know what he means by that. We don't know for sure how the Reverend Dr. Bethancourt interprets critical race theory. Ultimately, I think that what we have to do is what I call pattern matching. Does the pattern of practices and behaviors we see in UU match the practices and behaviors associated with the identity-centric movement? Do we see actions and behaviors that strongly emphasize identity and identity group memberships? Do we see a practice of openly suppressing dissenting points of view? Do we see instances of UU embracing training that triggers emotional discomfort? Do we sometimes see an open rejection of liberal values like logic and reason? And I want to look at some other trends in UU. To help us think of this in a visual way, I created this graphic showing how these pillars of beliefs and norms are what Western culture are built on. And I didn't have time to talk about the valued ways of doing and the valued ways of being. But good examples would be meritocracy, efficiency, competition, and civility. I call them organizational values that we prioritize. And here are some of the liberal Enlightenment values, some of which I did talk about. Democratic rule, due process, individualism, logic, and reason. Overall, some are norms for how to do things, some are norms for how to decide what's true and real. The mission we've heard about in UU since 2017 is to dismantle white supremacy culture, dismantle cultural norms like civility. If dismantling white supremacy culture should include decentering individual dignity, as was called for in that 2018 CSAI, valued ways of being like civility would appear to be devalued. I think we see a devaluing of democracy in UU in recent years. You know, the democratic process is not just about delegates voting at General Assembly. I think we're seeing less adherence to fair due process. For some issues, particularly issues related to identity, the court of public opinion seems to have taken the place of fair due process. I think competition is really frowned upon in UU. I've read about UU leaders saying that the democratic process doesn't require a competition between multiple candidates, and that has never made any sense to me. Sometimes practices aimed at efficiency are resisted as being characteristics of white supremacy culture. I've read places where perfectionism is resisted with a sense of pride about not being sticklers for accuracy. I also think there's been a concerted effort to stamp out what they call excessive individualism in UU. I also think there's been a direct attack on merit. And this one I felt could use some show and tell. There's a section in the Widening the Circle of Concern report titled Nominating Committees as Agents of Change. It says nominating committee members should see themselves as a part of the process of change making. They should only nominate candidates with clear training, experience, and background in counter-oppression work and ministry. Ideological alignment with the UU's vision of anti-oppression work is more important than experience or skills. And that is a demotion of the value of merit. And the one that perhaps worries me the most is the outright rejection of the value of reason and logic, and by implication, the need for evidence to support claims of knowledge. Time for another show and tell. Let's look at this assertion. It says, we recognize that a zealous commitment to logic and reason over all other forms of knowing is one of the foundational stones of white supremacy culture. This should sound familiar. It comes from an infamous piece of UU history, an open letter from white Unitarian Universalist ministers regarding the Gadfly Papers. This letter was written on June 22nd, 2019, and eventually signed by over 500 white UU ministers and assorted white UU leaders. I think this is what the dismantle part of dismantle white supremacy culture really means. At this point, you might be wondering, how much does this really matter to the average UU? What happens in Boston, well, just happens in Boston, right? Or nowadays on Zoom. What happens at General Assembly is just some distant noise that doesn't affect what happens in our congregations, right? Well, maybe not yet. In order for this dismantling to be a mandate, not just an aspiration, it would need to go into the bylaws. So let's look at the changes to Article 2 in the bylaws that are being proposed. The language of dismantling is going to be inserted into the justice value. And UUs will be committing to be accountable to one another for doing that work. If our new UUA president has any say in this, this accountability will be real accountability. At a talk she gave at General Assembly in 2022, she made it very clear. Covenant without consequences is not actually covenant. And by the way, that's Dr. Elias Ortega sitting next to her, nodding his head in agreement. This dismantling is going to be the highest priority in UU. How do we know that? Because UUs will be doing the work through the spiritual discipline of love. And what is the spiritual discipline of love? Love with a capital L. According to the charge, love is our commitment to personal, institutional, and cultural change, rooted in anti-oppression, anti-racism, and multicultural values and practice. So love is change. And this love in action is centered in the proposed revision to Article 2. So this dismantling will officially be the top priority in UU, and this process will probably accelerate. Speaking of the proposed Article 2 rewrite, it's interesting to look at it from a 30,000-foot level. So I've talked about reform versus dismantle and replace. Do you remember the process the Article 2 Commission used? They basically started over from scratch. Their engagement with UUs was centered around reimagining Article 2, as if what came before is all disposable. The Article 2 revision is the first major attempt at change since declaring UU to be a white supremacy culture in 2017. Looking closely at the first draft of the Article 2 revision shows us what the activists think needs to be done to dismantle white supremacy culture in UU. I'm not going to go over each item in that first draft. What I want to focus on are 5 foundational principles of UU that have been in Article 2 since the merger in 1961 in one form or another. The first principle, the dignity and worth of every person. The fourth principle, the search for truth and meaning, has always been in there. In the fifth principle, freedom of conscience and belief. Also in the fifth principle, the democratic process. And the sixth principle, world community. All have been in Article 2 since 1961 in one form or another. So, what did the original draft in October of 2022 propose? The Commission didn't change the first principle too much, although I think a right to flourish is kind of ambiguous. As far as the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, they completely removed it in the first draft, even though it's been a foundational principle since the 1961 merger. The individual freedom of belief had limits on expression added in that first draft, but that seemed to generate some pushback. So in the latest version, individual freedom of belief is proposed to be removed. And there is no explicit commitment to a right of conscience in that revision, even though that is what a free faith and a liberal religion meant at the time of the 1961 merger. And now it's gone. The use of the democratic process was completely left out in that first draft in October. The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, gone. Now, if the committee had followed the lead of the 2018 CSAI and decentered individual dignity, none of the legacy principles would have been retained. Now, wisely, they did not do that. And in later drafts, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning was put back in, although they added some extra words at the beginning. And at first glance, it looks like the democratic process was also put back in, but this might be misleading. First of all, the word support signals the lack of true commitment. It sounds like you can use democratic processes, but it's going to be optional. But I'm more concerned about this word inclusive. That phrase, inclusive democratic processes, might have a special meaning. There was a workshop at General Assembly in 2020 titled Charting a Future for Inclusive Democracy. Inclusive democratic processes might imply some kind of resource redistribution, sort of a move towards socialism. So this might not be an endorsement of Western liberal Enlightenment style democracy after all. The point is, this is what dismantling white supremacy culture with its direct repudiation of Western liberal Enlightenment values would look like in UU. Or maybe even like this, if it was totally up to the activists to decide. Of course, the commission didn't simply remove the principles they thought we should get rid of. They added a whole lot more words, which actually makes it hard to see what was missing in that first draft. Any time-traveling UU from the recent past would be baffled by these trends in UU. UU had always been focused on what we have in common, what unifies us, not the differences that separate us. UU had always been focused on the search for truth and meaning, not censoring voices. UU had always been about the dignity and worth of every person. UUs would not be endorsing shaming and blaming. And UU was founded on Enlightenment values. The UU time traveler would probably be thinking, what's happening here ain't exactly clear. These are all actions and behaviors that only make sense if UU leaders have embraced critical theory, postmodernism, standpoint theory, and intersectionality. And that appears to be what's happening here. Now, I've had many people ask me if I could end this talk on a more optimistic note, so I have two thoughts that might help. First, this is a clash of ideas, not a clash of peoples. I've been criticizing ideas, not the people who believe in those ideas. An overwhelming majority of people we come across in UU have their heart in the right place. People on both sides are absolutely sincere about their beliefs. We all seem to have the same general vision for where we want to be. We just disagree on how to get there. How we get there matters. First of all, we want to choose an approach that can work. But just as important, we want to choose an approach that reflects our values. Our hearts are in the right place, but if we let our hearts override our values, what does that say about us? I believe that Unitarian Universalists have an internal compass that helps us resist letting the ends justify the means, and that's a reason to be optimistic. And I have a second reason to be optimistic. Believe it or not, I would put my hopes on the people who think I'm not getting this right. Here's what I think it would take to move beyond this left versus left divide. Supporters and allies need to assert themselves. When supporters see a divisive emphasis on identity groups, they need to assert their belief that unity is what we need to be successful. When allies hear about alternative points of view being suppressed, they need to defend the belief that tolerance is critical for building a healthy, multicultural, diverse society. When supporters hear about plans for anti-racism training that uses potentially demeaning tactics, they need to affirm that the inherent worth and dignity of every person means individuals should not be blamed or shamed because of their identities. When allies hear reason and logic and due process being rejected, they need to remind everyone that liberal values are what have enabled the progress we have made. Insist that we should continue to focus on reforming our systems, not dismantling and replacing our systems. I don't think this is that far-fetched. For everyone who thinks that I'm getting this wrong, I would welcome them making it clear that the way I describe this movement is not what's happening here. Prove me wrong by supporting positive, unifying approaches to anti-racism and anti-oppression. I think this picture captures that feeling of unity perfectly. The last thing I want to do is show you some of my sources. Far and away, the best resource for understanding all of this is the book Cynical Theories. The core of this talk came from that book. It was published in 2020. I also think The Coddling of the American Mind is excellent. It mostly talks about what's happening in colleges. It was written back in 2018. This book in particular, The New Puritans, helped me feel more confident that I'm not just imagining all of this. The New Puritans demonstrated to me that this is not just an American movement. Andrew Doyle's book is actually focused more on Great Britain than the US. If you want to better understand what's happening in UU, I highly recommend the book Used to Be UU by Frank Casper and Jay Kiskell. Frank Casper wrote chapter 7 titled New UU Orthodoxy, and he does a fantastic job of dissecting the identity-centric movement. My final recommendation is to read the book Don't Label Me by Irshad Manji. Irshad offers some ideas about how to have conversations with people who do not share the same point of view as us. This slide and the next one collect most of the key points. Think of them as reference slides. This slide summarizes the ideology of the identity-centric movement. If you're watching a video recording of this talk, use the pause button. Then this slide summarizes some of the counterpoints that represent what traditional liberals believe. I want to thank everybody for being willing to listen to my perspective on the conflict between left and left in the US. And I look forward to hearing your comments and questions in the Q&A that's going to come next.